In the summer of 1945, during the Victory Day celebration in Red Square, Moscow, the Soviet Union basked in its triumph over Nazi Germany. The grand event, held in front of the Kremlin and Soviet leaders, was marked by the Russian army's display of power and celebration. Emulating traditions from ancient Rome, soldiers cast down the flags of their defeated enemies, presenting them as trophies of conquest. At the center of this monumental victory stood Generalissimo Joseph Stalin, hailed as the man who vanquished Adolf Hitler. With 2 decades of leadership behind him, Stalin was at the zenith of his political power and prestige. Poets immortalized him in verses that elevated his image beyond human stature. Stalin, you are higher than the celestial spaces, brighter than the sun, and greater than yourself. To many, he was revered as the small father of the people and a symbol of hope for a more just society. Across the globe, Stalin was idolized by millions. Even in countries like France, his admirers proclaimed their admiration and confidence in his leadership. Yet, behind the image of the celebrated leader lay the reality of one of history's most ruthless figures. Stalin's rule was marked by brutal purges, forced labor camps, and orchestrated famines that claimed millions of lives. Stalin's rise to power began in 1924, following the death of Vladimir Lenin, the architect of the Bolshevik Revolution. At the time, Stalin was a relatively obscure figure, serving as the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Many of his comrades underestimated him, dismissing him as a mediocre politician. However, Stalin harbored ambitions far greater than his colleagues anticipated. By employing cunning political maneuvers, he marginalized rivals like Leon Trotsky and consolidated his authority. Born Iosif Jagashvili in 1878, Stalin grew up in poverty under the oppressive regime of the Russian Empire. His father, an abusive alcoholic, left lasting scars on his childhood. Raised in the shadow of Orthodox clergy, Stalin eventually rebelled against the monarchy, adopting the name Stalin, meaning man of steel. He joined Lenin in the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, which dismantled the old order and sought to establish a society based on equality and shared prosperity. Once in power, Stalin embarked on a radical transformation of the Soviet Union. He aimed to erase the vestiges of Tsarist Russia and replace them with a new communist ideology. Religion was denounced, churches were destroyed, and massive industrial projects were launched to modernize the country. Stalin envisioned a utopia where poverty and unemployment were eradicated, but his policies often led to widespread suffering. Despite his public image as a visionary leader, Stalin's personal life remained shrouded in secrecy. He was distant from his family, and his relationships were fraught with tension. His wife, Nadezhda, struggled under his domineering nature, eventually taking her own life after years of emotional strain. Stalin's eldest son, Yakov, faced his father's cold indifference, even after a failed suicide attempt. Stalin's political methods were equally ruthless. He orchestrated show trials to eliminate perceived enemies, using confessions extracted under torture as evidence of guilt. Public execution served as warnings to those who might challenge his authority. His paranoia extended to even his closest allies, many of whom were purged during his reign. Under Stalin's rule, the Soviet Union achieved remarkable feats of industrialization, but at an immense human cost. While the nation built skyscrapers, subways, and power plants, its people endured famine, overcrowding, and poverty. Stalin's policies, often enforced with brutal efficiency, reflected his unwavering belief in the superiority of communism and his own infallibility. This is the story of a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most powerful and feared leaders in history. Stalin's legacy is a complex tapestry of industrial progress, ideological fervor, and unparalleled cruelty, a cautionary tale of the dangers of absolute power. These individuals, labeled enemies of the revolution, were not necessarily guilty of any crime. Many were ordinary citizens, intellectuals, or religious figures who simply did not align with the regime's vision. They were often grouped with common criminals in labor camps. The regime referred to this as re-education through labor, proudly presenting it as a way to rehabilitate deviant minds. In reality, these individuals were subjected to grueling conditions that turned them into little more than slaves. In the far northern camps, where temperatures plummeted to -50 degrees, survival itself became a test of endurance. One prisoner described the agony: "It's dangerous to stop moving. I can't stop kneading my toes and clenching my fists. Touching a metal tool with bare hands can tear the skin." Among the prisoners was Maria Iov, a political detainee. She reflected, "Our group is made up of intellectuals, but who could recognize a violinist or a scientist among these hollow-eyed figures? We exist in a state of perpetual numbness." The cruelty of the system became starkly apparent on August 2, 1933, with the inauguration of the Stalin Canal. This 200-kilometer waterway, dug by 300,000 prisoners using only basic tools, connected the White and Baltic Seas. The project was hailed as a feat of engineering. But it came at a horrific cost. 30,000 prisoners perished during its construction, only to have their efforts rendered futile. The canal was not excavated deeply enough, leaving it largely unusable for most ships. Outside the Soviet Union, the reality of these horrors was obscured. Western media often echoed Soviet propaganda, painting a rosy picture of progress. For example, a former Tsarist prison in Siberia was reported to have been repurposed for scientific rabbit breeding under Soviet guidance. Meanwhile, the gulags expanded, and the system of oppression deepened. Foreign delegations, including prominent intellectuals, visited Moscow, charmed by Stalin's facade. Some, like French writer Louis Aragon, even praised the regime's so-called rehabilitation programs, oblivious to the human suffering they entailed. Stalin, however, was consolidating his power through ruthless purges. By 1938, he had eliminated nearly all perceived threats, including his former allies. Bukharin, once a close companion, was branded a traitor and executed after a show trial. Across the USSR, the purges extended to ordinary families, driven by paranoia and quotas for arrests and executions. Neighbors, colleagues, and even children were coerced into denouncing one another. At the helm of this terror was Nikolai Yezhov, head of the secret police, who boasted of his role in enforcing Stalin's will. Yet even Yezhov was not immune to Stalin's paranoia. Accused of treason, he was executed and erased from history. Despite the terror, life in the Soviet Union continued outwardly as normal. Cultural events, such as performances of Swan Lake at the Bolshoi Theater, proceeded as Stalin signed nightly execution orders. His regime sought to replace the old guard with a loyal nomenclatura who benefited from the spoils of those purged. As Europe hurtled toward World War II, Stalin faced a new threat. Hitler, now firmly in power in Germany, harbored ambitions of expanding eastward. Despite a non-aggression pact signed in 1939, both dictators were biding their time, each plotting to outmaneuver the other. The world would soon descend into chaos with the German invasion of Poland, marking the beginning of the Second World War. Stalin's policies during the war reflected his relentless approach to maintaining control. Families of deserters were subjected to severe punishment, while specialized units oversaw soldiers with orders to act decisively in cases of retreat or panic. Despite strategic blunders, Stalin's decisions had monumental consequences. In Ukraine, he refused to allow the evacuation of Kyiv, leading to the capture of 500,000 Soviet soldiers in what became one of the largest surrenders in military history. By October 1941, 4 months after the launch of Operation Barbarossa, German forces had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow. Daily bombings forced civilians to seek refuge in subway tunnels, where fear and rumors spread rapidly. Writer Viktor Kravchenko described the atmosphere, saying, "Moscow feels like it's dying. Panic reigns, and wild rumors circulate." Some even speculated about a coup against Stalin. Against all advice, Stalin chose to remain in Moscow, addressing troops on November 7, 1941, during a snowstorm on Red Square. His speech stirred resolve among the gathered regiments, as he called on them to defeat the invading forces. The Soviet army soon stabilized the front near Moscow. By summer 1942, the war shifted to Stalingrad, a key strategic point. The German army sought control over the city to secure access to vital resources. The battle for Stalingrad became a grueling conflict, with urban combat so intense that soldiers fired blindly through smoke, relying on instinct. 2 million lives were lost during the siege of Stalingrad, but the tide turned when Soviet General Zhukov devised a plan to encircle German forces. In November 1942, a massive counteroffensive trapped 300,000 Axis soldiers. When Marshal Paulus surrendered, it marked the first capture of a German field marshal and a turning point in the war. Stalin's victory at Stalingrad earned him recognition as the first leader to defeat Hitler, solidifying his position as a wartime hero. However, his brutal methods persisted. The gulag swelled with millions of prisoners, and purges resumed, targeting anyone perceived as a threat. Internationally, Stalin was celebrated, particularly during his 70th birthday in 1949. Lavish gifts and accolades poured in from across the communist world, masking the harsh realities of his regime. Despite his growing power, Stalin's paranoia deepened. He alienated his children, sent allies to gulags, and initiated anti-Semitic campaigns. By 1945, Stalin's health had deteriorated, yet his influence remained unchallenged. After the war, he secured control over Eastern Europe, establishing Soviet dominance that would last nearly 5 decades. For the Russian people, victory came at an unimaginable cost, with millions dead and the country devastated. Stalin's death in March 1953 marked the end of an era. As news spread, reactions ranged from grief to quiet relief among his victims. Though he was revered by some, his legacy was marred by the suffering he inflicted. The man who promised utopia had ultimately caused the deaths of millions, leaving behind a complex and haunting historical legacy. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe, like, hit the notification button and don't forget to share.